In chapter 16, Jane Austen is developing two characters at once. The two foils of Darcy, Collins and then Wickham, are developed during this chapter. Before we get into that, let me explain just a small detail here. You'll notice in the text that occasionally Jane Austen has a blank, a line, and then a shire right after it. That's just a technical thing. This was frequently done in 19th century authorship, sometimes in 20th century authorship, where the author didn't want to locate his or her story in an exact place, lest they give offense to the people that actually lived there. It was sometimes done with the name of somebody that they didn't want to directly name, but you could infer from the circumstances who it was, or it was sometimes done with a place. You can infer where it was, but they didn't want to say exactly where it was. When you see a blank shire, just know that it was a place. Jane Austen just doesn't want to name that place directly. That being said, she goes about to develop the two characters of Wickham and of Collins in this chapter. We'll start with Collins as the shorter of the two, so to speak. Notice at first that she says that Collins goes on and on about Lady Catherine de Bourgh. At the very start of chapter 16 it says, in describing to her all the grandeur of Lady Catherine and her mansion, with occasional digressions in praise of his own humble abode and the improvements it was receiving, he was happily employed until the gentlemen joined them. Collins is trying to entertain the ladies, but he is so dull, so boring, that as it says, the girls could not listen to their cousin. They couldn't stand to be around him. He was so tedious. Well, he stops trying to entertain them when the gentlemen come in. Further on in the text, though, we see that when Wickham is the delight of everybody around, Collins sinks into the background. And in a way, this is like a commentary on Darcy, too, because as Wickham becomes on the ascendant in the imaginative world of Elizabeth, Darcy declines. He seems more cloddish and more base in the mind of Elizabeth. Well, the character of Collins is further developed as they sit down to cards, and Collins says he does not play at cards. Jane Austen writes this, with such rivals for the notice of the fair as Mr. Wickham and the officers, Mr. Collins seemed to sink into insignificance. To the young ladies he certainly was nothing, but he had still at intervals a kind listener in Mrs. Phillips, and was by her watchfulness most abundantly supplied with coffee and muffin. When the card tables were placed, he had the opportunity of obliging her in turn by sitting down to whist. I know little of the game at present, said he, but I shall be glad to improve myself, for in my situation in life— Mrs. Phillips was very glad for his compliance, but could not wait for his reason. Again, something of a comic element here, because Collins is always going on and on about himself and his own situation, and gets cut off even by Mrs. Phillips, who is simply listening to him as sort of an act of charity. Well, Collins is definitely the clod, and he certainly proves himself to be a clod further on in the text. But let's turn for a minute to Mr. Wickham, because the Wickham character is one which begins to rise in the imaginative world of Elizabeth. The first thing that we notice about Wickham is that he draws the attention of everybody around him. It says, when Mr. Wickham walked into the room, Elizabeth felt that she had neither been seeing him before, nor thinking of him since, with the smallest degree of unreasonable admiration. Mr. Wickham was, as far beyond everyone else, all the other gentlemen, in person, countenance, air, and walk, as they were superior to the broad-faced, stuffy Uncle Phillips, breathing port wine, who followed them into the room. Mr. Wickham was the happy man towards whom almost every female eye was turned, and Elizabeth was the happy woman by whom he finally seated himself, and the agreeable manner in which he immediately fell into conversation, though it was only on its being a wet night, made her feel that the commonest, dullest, most threadbare topic might be rendered interesting by the skill of the speaker. Notice that all the other women like Mr. Wickham. They find him cute, he's attractive, he's good-looking. And Elizabeth is very honored that he comes over and speaks to her. Partly she's attracted to him because he is good-looking and well-spoken, but she's also attracted to him because he's the focus of everybody else's attention. And when it comes to her, there's a sense of honor. Her pride is increased. She feels proud about herself that he would choose her among all the women. Well, they sit down to talk, and they begin discussing the nature of Mr. Darcy. And this is a very odd thing, because Mr. Wickham brings up the subject himself. It says that he asked in a hesitating manner how long Mr. Darcy had been staying there. And this launches them into a conversation about Darcy. And one thing that Jane Austen is very subtle about showing us is that Wickham is probing out to find out what he can get away with. To reveal something about him as a character, he is a guy who knows what women want to hear, and he tells them what they want to hear in order that he gets them on his good side. Consequently, he has no hesitation about bashing the character of another man or even a woman. And it says here in the text that that's exactly what he does. Elizabeth says, "I find Mr. Darcy very disagreeable." Wickham responds, "I have no right to give my opinion as to his being agreeable or otherwise. I'm not qualified to form one. I have known him too long and too well to be a fair judge. It is impossible for me to be impartial, but I believe your opinion of him would in general astonish, and perhaps you would not express it quite so strongly anywhere else. The world is blinded by his fortune and consequence, or frightened by his high and imposing manners, and sees him only as he chooses to be seen." What Wickham says is that Darcy is overly proud, and that is exactly what Elizabeth has been intimating. So Wickham knows what she wants to hear and tells her back what he thinks that she already has an opinion of Darcy. She says readily, "I should take him, even on my slight acquaintance, to be an ill-tempered man." To this, then, Wickham reveals his version of the story, of what Darcy has done in order to injure him. But notice in this, all of it turns back to Wickham. Wickham thinks only of himself, and so everything is said in the context of doing injury to Wickham. As he says here, "Darcy's father, Miss Bennet, the late Mr. Darcy, was one of the best men that ever breathed, and the truest friend I ever had. And I can never be in company with this Mr. Darcy without being grieved to the soul by 1,000 tender recollections. His behaviour to myself has been scandalous, but I verily believe I can forgive him anything and everything, rather than his disappointing the hopes and disgracing the memory of his father." What Wickham is intimating here, of course, is that Darcy has done him wrong. And he knows that Elizabeth already thinks poorly of Darcy, and so he's trying to get on her good side, and he does so primarily by telling the story from his own context. But then he also adds things that he knows women like to hear, or what he thinks women like to hear. He says, "A military life is not what I was intended for, but circumstances have now made it eligible. The church ought to have been my profession. I was brought up for the church, and I should at this time have been in possession of a most valuable living, had it pleased the gentleman we were speaking of just now." Wickham goes on to suggest that Darcy deprives him of his right income, which is to be a member of the church. And he expresses it in such a way that it sounds as though he has a profound love for the things of the church. He wants to be a holy man. Well, that's very appealing to a young lady who wants to see in a good-looking, well-spoken man a sense of piety and holiness. All that wrapped up in a nice, neat little package, so to speak. Wickham casts it in such a way that everything is favorable to him and everything is disfavorable to Darcy. This is also in contrast to what we hear earlier about Mr. Collins, who doesn't sound at all like a man who loves the church or loves the things of God. Wickham puts himself in such a light that he looks brilliant and beautiful. And Elizabeth is honored by hearing him, but honors also those feelings. And it says, "thought him handsomer than ever as he expressed them." Wickham goes on to suggest that Darcy acts out of jealousy. Jealousy because Mr. Darcy Sr. liked Wickham more than his own son. But then he also suggests that it's done primarily out of pride, filial pride and brotherly pride. He knows Elizabeth already thinks this way about Darcy, and it produces the desired effect. Elizabeth thinks this is abominable, that this is dishonest on the part of Darcy, and consequently she is blinded by the beauty of Wickham and by the good words of Wickham, and blinded by her own preconceived notions of Darcy, to think poorly of Darcy and well of Wickham. Thus she is incapable of seeing anybody else telling her differently. When she has a conversation with Jane in chapter 17 and tells the whole story, Jane says, "This doesn't sound right. This doesn't sound like something Mr. Darcy would do. I don't know what to think. We don't know what to think." And to this, Elizabeth says, "I beg your pardon. One knows exactly what to think." But Jane's still skeptical. Jane, who is sort of an impartial judge to a degree, doesn't want to think poorly of Darcy yet. Well, all this comes to a head then in this dance that occurs in chapter 18. And there's a great deal to talk about here in chapter 18. Primarily at the ball, Elizabeth is asked to dance by Mr. Darcy. And during the dance, she has a conversation with Mr. Darcy, which is rather tense, rather cold. But Darcy suggests here that he has always tried to be impartial. And Elizabeth is taken aback by this. She says, "Are you serious in what you're saying?" Jane Austen says, "He made no answer, and they were again silent till they had gone down the dance. And when he asked her if she and her sisters did not very often walk to Meryton, she answered in the affirmative, and unable to resist the temptation, added, 'When you met us there the other day, we had just been forming a new acquaintance.'" The effect was immediate. A deeper shade of hauteur overspread his features, but he said not a word, and Elizabeth, though blaming herself for her own weakness, could not go on. At length Darcy spoke, and in a constrained manner said, "Mr. Wickham is blessed with such happy manners as may ensure his making friends. Whether he may be equally capable of retaining them is less certain." Darcy remembers in contrast to Wickham and Collins. Here it's obvious there's an antipathy between Wickham and Darcy. But Elizabeth has already been somewhat wooed over, seduced by the image of Wickham, and so she's prone already, predisposed, to think of Darcy poorly. So when she brings up the acquaintance with Wickham, intentionally trying to get Darcy's goat, Darcy immediately reins in and gets very formal with her. And he is therefore incapable after that of seeing Elizabeth in the same light, because he thinks that she's being won over by Wickham. When they have a conversation about Darcy's nature, she doesn't think that he's being honest. It says in the text, "You are very cautious, I suppose, as to your opinion being created." "I am," said he with a firm voice. "And never allow yourself to be blinded by prejudice?" "I hope not." "It is particularly incumbent upon those who never change their opinion to be secure of judging properly at first." "May I ask to what these questions tend?" "Merely to the illustration of your character," said she, endeavoring to shake off her gravity. "I'm trying to make it out." "And what is your success?" And she shook her head. "I do not get on at all. I hear such different accounts of you as puzzle me exceedingly." "I can readily believe," answered he gravely, "that reports may vary greatly with respect to me. And I could wish, Miss Bennet, that you were not to sketch my character at the present moment, as there is reason to fear that the performance would reflect no credit on either." Darcy knows that she's influenced by Wickham, and he is terribly fearful that his judgment of her, thinking of her as beautiful and as different from the other women, might have been wrong. Remember that Darcy's been trapped in a box of his own, that the society around him that expects all these things and demands all these things, and all these women that seek him only for his money, have made him so that he's becoming more and more cynical about human nature, thinking that there are no good people, that there are no good women. The only women he has ever known, have been gold diggers. And now he finds Elizabeth thinking that she's something different, she's something special. But maybe he's wrong. Maybe she too is just like every other woman and is being seduced by the person of Wickham to think poorly of him and to become less of a person. This fear on his part, that perhaps he's going to spend the rest of his life alone, makes him more and more cynical. But Elizabeth's opinion of Darcy, that he is more and more proud, seems to be becoming calcified in her imaginative world, so much so that she can't hear advice from anybody else. And, as the novel would have it, she has advice from somebody, Miss Bingley, though, and she's already predisposed against Miss Bingley, too. And Caroline Bingley comes to her and tells her, basically, be careful of Wickham. He is not somebody to be trusted. He is essentially somebody who uses women and throws them away. But she, because she's predisposed to dislike Caroline, says, I don't want to listen to you at all. And ends up thinking of her only as an insolent girl. Well, then Jane Austen has an interesting comic take where she has each member of the Bennet family then trying to outdo one another for embarrassing Elizabeth. Collins first goes and introduces himself to Darcy, and that's embarrassing. It's terribly embarrassing to Elizabeth. And then further on, Mary is singing a dreadful tune that embarrasses Elizabeth again. And then her mother is speaking very loudly about the marriage to Jane that's going to be coming up in the future. And all these improprieties embarrass Elizabeth. But they also make Darcy suddenly become very wary of his own position, that maybe he shouldn't ally himself with this woman and her family. More to the point, his friend Bingley shouldn't ally himself with Jane, because Jane and Bingley have been dancing every dance together and spending the evening together, and Darcy is suddenly very aware of the crisis that this family, Elizabeth and Jane's family, might pose not just to his reputation, but to the reputation and happiness of his friend, Mr. Bingley. Elizabeth is very aware of the embarrassment, and it says in the text, "To Elizabeth it appeared that had her family made an agreement to expose themselves as much as they could during the evening, it would have been impossible for them to play their parts with more spirit or finer success." Consequently, the chapter ends with Elizabeth still thinking poorly of Darcy, but also being very embarrassed by her family because she's also very aware of Darcy's criticism and his critique, and of Darcy beginning to think maybe he was wrong about Elizabeth, and maybe he's going to spend the rest of his life in terrible loneliness and isolation.